from New York, Mr. Israel, and a member opposed. Each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment is very simple. It would direct the CBO to analyze the impact of our major bills here in Congress on some of the nation's most critical institutions, our state and local governments, and state and local taxpayers. The State Budget Crisis Task Force is co-chaired by the former Lieutenant Governor of the State of New York, Richard Ravitch, and the former Federal Reserve Board Chair, Paul Volcker. And they spent a great deal of time analyzing the impacts of what we do here on state and local governments and taxpayers. And what did they find? They found that fiscal stress runs downhill, and very often local taxpayers are the recipient of that stress. Everything we do here in Congress, Mr. Chairman, or everything we don't do has significant implications for other levels of government and local taxpayers. But no mechanism exists at all to assess the fiscal impact of federal actions on those taxpayers. I'm offering this amendment today because if we're going to analyze how our fiscal actions affect the economy, we need to make sure we're not just pushing off the hard decisions to local taxpayers. Let me give you an example. The budget offered by my good friend, the gentleman from Wisconsin, the Republican budget, cuts over $50 billion from road repair and infrastructure investments. And so the implication of that budget is that the federal government does less, but local taxpayers have to pay the bill to fill in the potholes. That's just fundamentally wrong. That's a wrong priority. We have to stop staying in this position where we are cutting taxes and spending here only to increase taxes and spending in our local communities. We can't keep pushing off these costs and the accompanying uncertainty surrounding this funding. That's why my amendment is so important, Mr. Chairman. It would tell us that we are actually being fiscally responsible at all levels. Or are we simply moving cost from one level of government to the other? I hope my friends will support this amendment. We all represent not just federal taxpayers, but local taxpayers, and we should protect the interests of both. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York reserves the gentleman. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I claim the time in opposition.
The gentleman from Georgia claims 5 minutes in opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this truly is a great idea. There's no question that Congress ought to have more information about the legislation that we're going to consider and how it affects state and local governments. Far too often, we in Washington decide that we're smarter than everyone else and choose to impose burdens on those governments that are closer to the people. Frankly, far too many of us here in Congress simply don't take the principle of federalism seriously. In fact, this is such a great idea that a Republican Congress passed it and a Democratic president signed it into law in 1995. It's called the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act, or more popularly, UMRA. This law requires CBO to analyze every piece of legislation for the burdens that it imposes on state and local governments. Here's how CBO describes their work under the law. In 1995, the UMRA was enacted to ensure that the Congress receives information during the legislative process about federal mandates, requirements that would be imposed on state, local, and tribal governments, and on entities in the private sector. So, as with this amendment we'll debate, the job's already done. And as with the next amendment, the job's already done. The issue is already addressed. So I appreciate the gentleman's interest in the issue, but there's simply for the amendment, and consequently we will have to oppose the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Georgia yields back the balance. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I thank the Chair. Two responses to my friend from Georgia. Number one, the law that he cites does not analyze the impact of budget and tax decisions that we engage in here in Washington, D.C. So the gentleman's response, with all the respect in the world, is wrong. Secondly, I do find it ironic that this entire debate has focused on the critical need for more information. I've heard my friends talk about the need for a complete picture. Except when it comes to local taxpayers, we don't want that information. We don't need to see that picture. We will continue to pass legislation and pass the bill to those local taxpayers. So for all the high-minded speeches that we hear from my friends about needing to protect the taxpayer, opposing this amendment essentially says to the taxpayer, you foot the bill for the decisions we make here. So we talk about cutting taxes, and we put out our press releases, and we pat ourselves on the back for cutting federal taxes and cutting spending. when what we're really doing is stabbing local taxpayers in the backs with those decisions. With that, I close, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yield back.
I yield back the balance of my time.
Yield back to balance time. Balance time has expired. Questions on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair.
Mr.
The
Chairman,
noes have it. What purpose the gentleman from New York rise?
On that, I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6, Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York will be